Dr. Goldiamond, if behavior is governed by the consequences, how come people do so many things which get them consequences that they don't want?
Well, it isn't necessarily very often a matter of wanting things. People may be governed by consequences that they're not exactly, they don't even know they exist. There's a famous study there by Heffeline, done a long time ago at Columbia. He took people, musicians, students, and the like, put earphones on their heads, they heard music that they liked to hear, and it was interrupted by static. They had all kinds of leads over their hand, electrical leads. Some of them were connected to the thumb muscles, some to the finger muscles. They were all over the place. And now he arranged that when one, and only one, of the muscles in the thumb twitched, they got the electrical recording of that, and that spike turned off the static. Mm-hmm. And soon that was twitching as rapidly as possible practically all the time. The person was not aware not only of the consequences that this was producing, the relation it was producing to, they wasn't even aware of the behavior.
Okay, well, what about someone who commits a crime for which the consequence is prison?
Well, now, in this case, jail might be not the issue involved. Money is the consequence. Getting money, being with your friends, committing this whole crime, the thrill of it, and so forth. This can be, the consequences of the bank robbery can be all of these. Now, the jail can be an unwanted and undesirable product of more sensible behavior.
Well, you said it can be just a byproduct. Does that mean that it can be other things besides just that byproduct?
Yes, jail or mental hospitals can be unattractive to us. They can, on the other hand, be attractive to some people when you consider their alternatives. One of the patients I interviewed had been in the state hospital 9 times. This was his 9th admission, and the listing was so-and-so, paranoid schizophrenic, quote, with such a seething hostility against society that he literally acted out the statement to have a kick against by kicking over a garbage can in the presence of 2 Chicago policemen. And that's the end of that part. And I said to him, now, how did you get in here? He said, I kicked over a garbage can. I said, couldn't you think of some better way to get in? He said, hell, I tried. I applied for voluntary, but they wouldn't let me in.
Well, what sense does that make?
Well, nobody would hire him. He had 8 admissions up to that point. And the record is pretty bad. They can't hire him. And so he sponges off his parents. When he's through with sponging off his parents, and they're pretty poor people, he sponges off his friends. When he's at his friend's house, he told me, he says, I function at the 6th grade level. And I said, gee, that's sort of strange to hear you, can you tell me about it? And he said, well, he says, I read these textbooks, some of them have kids, and I can answer all the questions up to the 6th grade. He says, but I can't answer beyond that. He says, but that modern math, boy, that throws me. He says, what do I do now? Anyway, we discussed this further, and he says, okay, so I'm through with my friends, too. He says, I can hold up somebody, but he says, they're as poor as I is. So he's, so what does he do? He sort of then, he isn't aware of the fact that he's sort of acting crazy on purpose, but it's the behavior that's required under this.
Yeah. Someone who needs the mental hospital as a substitute for the other types of security that many of us have.
That's right, it's asylum. It's asylum.
Well, of course, by that standard about seething hostility, then they should probably lock us all up against society. So why, if there are that many of us who probably would have a similar reaction in many cases if we're frustrated long enough, why is the state shutting down so many mental hospitals? Why are they just falling down across the country?
Well, it's much cheaper to farm them out. It used to cost, years ago, last time I looked at it, was about $4,700. Cost of living is up, to keep somebody in a state hospital. And then they were paying, I think it was about 8 years ago, they were paying $200 a month for these shelter cares in private hands. And it became cheaper to farm out, but if the mental institutions themselves weren't telling people how to live or helping them that way, certainly these homes aren't either. They're not telling people how to live.
Well, the state is then taking a pathological approach to the situation by eliminating the institutions. They're not building anything up, they're just eliminating the steps, I guess.
That's right, but you see, it makes sense for the state to do it. It's not so pathological of them, not so sick of them. It makes sense. They save the money. If they dump them out and they wander out in the streets and they don't have jobs, then the federal welfare assistance can pick them up. And so the various legislators and the governor can pose and say, I'm saving money for you. And so basically it's, we have to look at the consequences. It makes sense for the state to do this. It makes sense for people to do this. And they're faced with some horrible choices. And I sort of get sick myself of hearing people talk about sick people, of hearing people talk about sick societies. Rather, we should be talking about the ways all of us can get the consequences which make sense and which are legitimate, how we get them by other means.
Okay, well that means we're talking again about the constructional approach. Each of us is an individual. We have different strength than our friends and are governed by different sets of consequences. Because we are different, we respond as individuals to similar situations, and what we do may not make sense to somebody else, just as it may be difficult to determine why they respond the way they do. By looking at the consequences and their relation to what is done, we can frequently make sense of odd or so-called crazy behaviors. Use the procedures we learned in the past 2 sessions. Remember, we need not be aware of the consequences to be affected by them. Let's see what sense can be made of our emotions. Emotions often don't make sense. If I'm insulted, I see red. Now, what sense does looking at consequences make of emotions?
What you're saying in that case of emotions is that that which preceded the behavior produced it. For example, if you're in the woods and you see a bear, you feel frightened, and that's why you run. Is that it?
Fear makes you run.
Yeah. Well, see, that's the classical theory. I see the bear, I am frightened, therefore I run. The James Lange theory says, I see the bear, I run, therefore I'm frightened.
I don't follow that. What's the difference?
Well, in the second case, what happens is the behavior precedes the emotion. It's the feedback to the brain from the muscles, the glands, the various organs, and so forth. You start to run, and it's the feedback from that which produces the emotion.
Well, for example, just a case that I could think of is when there's a crisis and I run around and I do things and I'm perfectly calm, and then when it's all over I go, oh my God, and I'm scared to death or whatever. Which do you favor? Which do you think is right?
Well, in a sense, I could say a plague of both their houses. That's pathological. I could also say they're both right.
Professors.
Okay, yes. It sort of adds something. What both of them are leaving out are the consequences. For example, let's take a look. I see the bear. Now, the reason I see the bear is I've been wanting a bear skin over my fireplace. So I've got myself a hunting license. I've learned how to hunt. So I see the bear. Boy, am I excited. See? And I pick up that rifle, and I point it at the gun, and I pull the trigger, and nothing happens.
Oops.
Oops, then I look around, and no bullets there. I look in my bag, and nothing there. I have some nice sandwiches packed by my daughter instead, and now the bear comes after me. The bear chases me. I run. The bear chases me.
Well, you mean you'll get clobbered if you don't run, and therefore you're scared.
That's right. I'm running because of the fear of getting clobbered. And so that governs both the running and the fear. Whereas it's the getting clobbered which is doing it. All the way through it, you don't like that consequence. And so I am both of them. I run, I'm scared because of the consequences, and I keep running, and he chases me, and finally I have no place to go. There's a cliff. And I can't climb up it. And I confront him, and I can't, so what I do is
You start using the...
using the butt of the gun after him. And so I attack him with the butt of the gun.
Does that mean you're angry?
Well, you're right. I see red now. Now I see red, you see. And, but you see, the reason I'm doing this is to get him off my back, literally. And the bear rears at me. And I hear a ripping sound. And I look, and it's ripped down the front, and there's a tie falls out, and so forth. And this is supposed to be a joke on me. And the reason I don't have bullets in the gun is my daughter was in on the joke. And she arranged it that way. And so basically now, if I don't laugh, I'm a poor sport. So I got to be with the group. And so, well, I've got to be a poor sport. So I laugh and I enjoy it. And the
You
whole
don't get
darn
mad?
thing. Well, I sort of get mad, but...
Furious to the point of homicide?
Well, one might be, but phew, after what I've been through before, and on it, my daughter's in on it too,
Well, you mean you have to consider the context? Is that what you're saying here?
That's right. You're not a good sport if you're mad, so you laugh.
Well, you're speaking of appropriate emotions?
That's right. Behaviors and emotions, they both occur in the context of the consequences, and sometimes the consequences of the particular behavior, which is tied in with emotion at that point, that consequence is not the behavior isn't appropriate to the consequence. And then we have to start examining our emotions the minute we start feeling them for them to try to get some appropriate behaviors and teach people appropriate emotions.
Well, when I'm called a name, don't I strike out because I'm angry?
Not necessarily. What I tell people who do this is the reason you struck out at this person is not because you were angry, but because you've been a bully in the past. That is, when you struck out at somebody and lashed out at them for hurting you, you certainly don't lash out at somebody for being absolutely nice to you. When you lashed out for somebody for being hurt at you, they stopped hurting you, they stopped the name calling, and you got this by being a bully.
Well, but that can backfire too, can't it?
That's right. The appropriateness varies from situation to situation and from time to time. What's appropriate at one age when you're a little kid is not appropriate when you're an adult. So you have to learn to do what is appropriate in terms of getting you what you want and to avoid getting clobbered.
Well, say if in a situation where I'm going to get clobbered, I control myself. I'm more likely to get what I want by being friendly. It's more, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. Why don't we put the gun away? I don't like guns.
Yes. Fine.
Okay. So I'm going to get more of what I want by being friendly than I will if I try to threaten.
Yeah. What you have to do is to discover what is it that's causing the anger. And you have to try to change that causal situation by the most appropriate means.
You mean a constructional approach. You look at the emotions, you see the cause, you analyze the consequences, and then how to get them.
That's right. The different emotions reflect different situations and consequences, which then reflect different solutions. It's related to your remembered experiences. I remember, and sometimes you don't even remember them, but they sort of govern you. I remember when I was in the hospital with, learning how to use the wheelchair and a few other things. One of the statements made about aphasics, people who've suffered brain damage of a kind, which we'll get into later, is that they're emotionally labile, they keep changing their emotions, they undergo personality change, and so forth and so on. And there was a man there who used to be on the waiting lines for food, and he couldn't speak. He'd get furious. Now, he got furious. There was another guy who would sort of do it like this. There was a woman who had been a school teacher, and she would start to speak, and the wrong word would come out, and would sort of smile, and then continue the next word, like she must have been a good teacher. She was rewarding in her class, and so on. But I recall the woman came to me about her husband, the one who kept losing his temper. And she said, he's changed. He used to be such a sweet person all the way through. And so I said, no, let's see, has he changed? Right now, he cannot get what he's after. He can't get his way at all. Tell me, I said, in the past, what was he like when he didn't get his way? And so she thought for a minute. She said, yeah, he would lose his temper. And so I said, yeah, you're not telling me that he has changed. What you're telling me is about how you yielded in the past. You're telling me about you. And she looked for a moment, and she said, you know, she said, you're right. She said, he hasn't changed. There's been no personality change. He's the same person, but he's confronted with these new situations now.
Right.
Or not the new ones.
Or
He's
more
confronted more of the situations that before everybody had learned to get away from. See, he'd been an effective bully. Everybody learned to avoid doing the things which got him angry. And now these other people don't know about it. And so you see, the emotions are related to the behaviors and not only the present, and not only, but also that whole history of the past consequences too.
Okay. There are two things to remember about emotions which help us make sense of them. First, emotions are governed by the situation, what we can do in that situation, and the consequences of our behavior. It is the relationship between what we do and the consequences which determine the emotion we experience. Second, emotional behavior itself often produces consequences, and the emotional behavior may be related to the effect it has on others. In either case, using the emotions we feel or the emotional behavior of others as a cue to analyze the consequences is very frequently productive, making sense of the emotions. Let's look a little more closely at how to do this. So the behaviors and emotions make sense when we look at the consequences. Now, I know some of the procedures for discovering the consequences take a lot of time. Are there any shortcuts you can tell us about?
Yes, the best shortcut we can use on this is to simply put yourself in the other person's boots and ask, if I were faced with the same circumstances, what would I be getting out of it? How come I would be doing it? And this doesn't mean the other person is putting on an act at all. It may have been shaped up in a variety of ways. But if we put ourselves in the person's boots, we're liable to gain valuable insights by figuring out the consequences and the alternatives the other person is subject to.
You mean like the Indian statement about walking from moon in the other person's moccasins?
That's right. The Indians had this understanding. Instead of labeling by behavior as psychotic, or saying it's an act, or saying it's neurotic, or this, that, the other, try to figure out what's going on. What alternatives does that person have? Or what sense does it make? And it turns out we can literally learn a tremendous amount from putting ourselves in the other person's moccasins.
Well, by putting, say, myself in the situation of the man with the brain damage, I could feel then his frustration.
Yeah. This is true even in cases of where brain damage has been made. Of course, brain damage causes all kinds of changes and there are losses. But let's take the case of aphasia that I mentioned, in which you lose something related to speech as a result of brain damage, usually a stroke. There was a colonel in the Army that we knew who had always given orders in the past and gotten them carried out. Well, he could no longer do it. He couldn't give the orders as well. He talked and made sense after a while, but he couldn't bark them out. And one day, we showed him an umbrella, and we said to him, what's this? And he looked at it, and he went, "Bumblewaffer." And we used the sense that the term bumblewaffer made in a program. Basically, if you write out a bumblewaffer, that in the beginning is getting it out. But now look at it. You've got in umbrella.
In the bum.
You've got in the bum. You've got bamboo. You got an L-E. And in the actual word, it's an R-E, re, and we know L and R are interchangeable, as in rice, lice, back and forth. Sigmund Rhee is Sigmund Lee in China. And so these sounds are interchangeable. Similarly, now we have the umbrella, and this becomes waffer. and this becomes a Y. The L and the W, like look, wook. That too makes sense. People interchange them. The word cheval becomes cheval in the plural. There's the Polish L with a line through it, which is pronounced W. So L and W are interchangeable. So what he was doing is substituting lexically interchangeable units for the appropriate English ones. He was on target. He was not off target. And we very often, when we think we just don't know where we're going, we're often closer to being on target than we think we are. And that's why I said one can learn from psychotics, neurotics, people in trouble. We don't assume that the person is possessed. We don't assume that he is defective or incomplete. I think the best thing to do is to assume that the person is like us. He's making sense. The task is to find out that sense.
By limiting ourselves to the alternatives available to someone and subjecting ourselves to the consequences he or she experiences, we can begin to understand the sense his or her behavior makes. In putting ourselves in their shoes, we can analyze the alternatives and figure out their choices or their lack of choices. The emotions they experience come to make sense. This technique has another use. Okay, we're using insights in a program. We can get feedback to see whether we're right or not.
Yes, and we can confirm this with other procedures and other observations that we make. But this kind of technique of assuming that the person makes sense, putting ourselves in our boots or putting ourselves in his boots, can be used in trying to figure out historical events and structures as well. For example, Stonehenge comes readily to mind. This was viewed as this odd collection of rocks, pillars. Stonehenge means either stone horses or hanging stones. And it was viewed as being produced by some kinds of superstitious savages. A man named Gerald Hawkins had a different kind of notion. He's an astronomer, and he started out with what he said was a kind of very simple hypothesis which has led him a great distance. The hypothesis was, he said, that I am going to assume that if I can understand what sense there is in the alignment these stones make and the holes in them make, then it must have made the same sense to the builders as well. And he says this seems to be a very simple hypothesis. It carried him a great deal of distance, because to him it made sense as a computer. And he fed it in, and it turned out to be a tremendous computer. Not only did it confirm that, but he says we also learned from it, because there were 56 holes in a circle, and he didn't know what that meant. We don't know what it meant. So he turned it over to the computer, and the computer came back. Well, I said, of course, don't you know that certain kinds of eclipses occur in cycles of 56 years? We didn't know that. We discovered it, or rather, we discovered something they already knew. So here we assume this is astronomical functions, not only this, not only Stonehenge, but all over the place. A lot of these things that are being left behind by ancestors of ours, I say, ancestors in a larger sense. What was done at Stonehenge was done elsewhere. There are these big statues of the Easter Islands. There are carvings in Africa. There are things in South America. They appear all over the place. These can have a variety of functions, including astronomical functions, and we can actually learn from it.
I remember when I was at Stonehenge, I was fortunate enough to be there at sunset, and then it was much more comprehensible to me. He used the same technique. He put himself in their shoes and said, well, what were these people trying to learn or do or whatever? And therefore, he assumed that it made sense and was able to see that it did.
Yep.
I was very comfortable at Stonehenge, which is a strange thing to say, I guess, but I was.
It has, you realize, of course, there have been a variety of alternative explanations. That's why his was so new.
The druids and the slaughtering and the blood. I know all that.
One of them was, of course, the one you just said. These were crazy or superstitious people. They did sacrifices on them. The other was, gee, these things are such magnificent feats. It couldn't have been our ancestors. I mean, they couldn't have put these stuff out in Easter Island. They couldn't have made these tremendous carvings in the jungles in Africa. They couldn't have done these things. So it wasn't our ancestors, it was somebody else who'd done it.
The unearthly visitor.
That's right, spacemen from all over, the chariots of the gods. And the third one was, this is a superior civilization. It was the past Atlantis, something like that, which has since destroyed itself, just like we're going to destroy
ourselves. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't think there's been any evidence that I know of for the last one that they destroyed themselves,
Yeah.
Because certainly as much of Stonehenge that's left wouldn't still be there.
Yeah, I think the best alternative that we can draw on is a fourth one. My Latin teacher would kill me for using alternative this way, but it's the fourth one, that it was us. It was our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
They made sense. And now, if you just imagine to think of the magnificence of that achievement, imagine how long it took for them to notice that these were these cycles of 56.
Mm-hmm.
For them even to have noticed that there were these cycles of 56.
That there were patterns.
That there were patterns. They had to have had a recording system of some kind. It was not computers, so they had to use these huge stones. They had no shortcuts. Basically none at all, and they just had to think it through, they had to plan it through, and they had to remember, and no
tough,
shortcuts.
down-to-earth, long-term record-keeping, which requires a lot of diligence.
That's right, and indeed it took intelligent men. We can take pride of our ancestors again, and it took society and a culture, and it took many years.
Well, I suppose then if we want to take that tag, we can say that Stonehenge and other phenomena like this do belong to us. That they didn't come from out there. They were part of ourselves, and by examining what happened in the past, we can probably do a lot better in the future. That strategy, assume that people make sense, helps us answer a lot of questions. Instead of simply labeling a person as sick or disabled or odd, those are cop-outs. We assume that he or she functions as we do, sensibly. Then by putting ourselves in their boots under the conditions which they encounter, we can begin to get an idea of the sense they make. In the next session, we begin to put this sense and our knowledge of consequences to use in practical programs. How do we get from where we are now to where we want to go? Well, another thing that we haven't talked too much about, say in my conversations with Dr. Goldiamond, but you and I talked about before the show, is love and how any sort of happening can affect it. Did you find generally that most people, when they got used to the idea, didn't really change their feelings? It just took a little while? Or did you have any experiences where someone really did a 180 turn on you?
Well, I don't really know, because I've been married, and then we had our differences, so we went our ways. But as far as dealing with other females, I haven't had any problem, As a matter of fact, I think...
I don't know if you should say that on TV, but I think we get the idea. Well, I think it's true. I know that you played Othello here at Kennedy King and got the Best Actor award, I believe. And I understand you're quite a basketball player, and as we can see, that you're a television cameraman.